Imagine a woman sitting alone in a completely bare hotel room. She's drinking sherry, playing an endless game of solitaire, and she has specifically instructed the staff to remove every single piece of artwork from the walls.
Right, which is just such an intense image.
It really is. She isn't hiding out, and she certainly isn't taking a vacation. She
Mhm.
is actively trying to trigger her own deeply buried childhood trauma. And, she isn't doing it to heal. She's doing it to fundamentally rewrite the rules of American literature.
Yeah, it completely shatters that romanticized idea we often have of the gentle, inspired writer just waiting for a muse to strike.
Yeah.
She was engineering a literal sensory deprivation chamber to force herself back into the most painful moments of her past.
Exactly. Well, welcome to today's deep dive into the source material. It is Sunday, March 29, 2026, and we are diving into a biographical record that honestly completely defies logic. And, you are the kind of listener who appreciates a shortcut to being well-informed, someone who wants the deep insights without drowning in the info overload. And today, our mission is to explore the sprawling life, the works, and the massive legacy of Maya Angelou. We're looking at her extensive biographical record to answer one central question. How did a woman with an incredibly traumatic and seemingly chaotic early life manage to synthesize her pain into a universal blueprint for resilience? And in the process, alter the entire genre of autobiography.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before she was Maya Angelou, the towering literary figure, she was Marguerite Annie Johnson.
Right. And to understand the global icon, we absolutely have to start with Marguerite. We have to move backward from the legend to the origins. I mean, she was born in 1928, and her early childhood was just defined by a profound lack of stability.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
When she was just 3 years old, her parents' marriage fell apart. She and her 4-year-old brother, Bailey, were put on a train by themselves.
Wait, by themselves?
By themselves. They literally had just tickets pinned to their coats, and they were sent to Stamps, Arkansas, to live with their paternal grandmother. And this is right during the height of the Great Depression. I can't even fathom that. 2 toddlers on a train alone, traveling across the country. But looking at the sources, it seems her grandmother, Annie Henderson, was this incredible anchor of strength for them.
She really was. She was an absolute exception to the economic reality of the time. She actually prospered financially during the Depression, which was unheard of.
Wow.
She owned a general store that started as a simple food stall catering to black workers. So Marguerite had this immediate template of extreme black female resilience right in front of her.
That's amazing.
It was. Her grandmother's store was the center of their community, but unfortunately that stability was violently interrupted. When Marguerite was 7, she and her brother were sent back to St. Louis to live with their other. And this is where the foundational trauma of her life occurs.
Right.
At age 8, she is sexually abused and raped by her mother's boyfriend, a man named Freeman.
It is just a horrific reality to confront. And the aftermath, it only compounds the trauma. She confided in her brother, who then told the family. Freeman was arrested and found guilty, but the justice system completely failed her. He only served 1 day in jail.
1 day, yes.
But then, 4 days after his release, he was found murdered. And the historical consensus is that it was likely Marguerite's uncles who killed him in retaliation.
And this specific sequence of events triggers a psychological reaction that dictates the entire next phase of her life. Because as an 8-year-old child, she doesn't have the emotional framework to process the justice system or, vigilante retribution.
Of course not. She's 8.
Right. She applies a very specific, tragic, magical thinking to the situation. She had spoken his name in court, and then he died. Therefore, she genuinely believed her voice had literally killed him.
Which is such a heavy burden for a child, to believe that simply speaking is lethal.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is the mechanism of her response. She didn't just become quiet. She decided she had to protect the world from her voice. She went completely mute for nearly 5 years.
5 whole years without speaking.
Yeah. But biographers and psychologists who look at this period note that this silence wasn't just a shutdown. It was an active, really intense incubation period. Deprived of the ability to speak, her other faculties just went into overdrive.
Oh, that makes sense.
This is the exact window where she developed her extraordinary photographic memory. She became a voracious reader, and she developed this hyper-tuned ability to listen and observe the nuances of human behavior. She was absorbing the cadence of the entire world around her.
That reframes it completely. It makes me think of a slingshot. You have this little girl being pulled back deeply into this dark, terrifying isolation. But the tension is just building and building. And when she is finally released, she is launched forward with this unstoppable linguistic force.
I love that analogy. That is exactly the dynamic at play. And the person who finally provided the release for that slingshot was a local teacher named Mrs. Bertha Flowers.
Right, the teacher who recognized her potential.
Exactly. She recognized Marguerite's intelligence and challenged her muteness with a brilliant piece of logic. She told her, "You do not love poetry, not until you speak it."
Oh, wow. What a line.
Right. She introduced the young girl to Dickens, Shakespeare, Edgar Allan Poe, and, crucially, Black female artists like Frances Harper. She didn't force her to speak about the trauma. She lured her voice back out, using the sheer beauty and power of the spoken word.
It makes you wonder about the quietest, most isolating moments in your own life. You know, when you feel completely silenced or forced into retreat. Is that actually just a secret training ground? Because once Marguerite gets her voice back, she doesn't just speak. She starts asserting herself in ways that seem almost audacious.
Oh, definitely.
I mean, by 16, she's back in California, and she decides she is going to be a streetcar conductor in San Francisco. And from what I read, she didn't do it out of some grand civil rights ambition. She did it because she liked the uniforms.
Yeah. She loved the money-changing belts and the smart caps. But beneath that aesthetic admiration is a profound psychological pivot. After years of feeling like she had to hide herself to protect others, she saw a uniform, which is a symbol of a recognized, structured public role in society, and she demanded to wear it.
She just wouldn't take no for an answer.
No, she lied about her age, sat in the office for weeks refusing to leave, and became the first Black female streetcar conductor in the city. She was breaking racial and gender barriers as a teenager, essentially asserting her right to take up space.
Okay, but I'm looking at her trajectory in her 20s, and I am completely lost. Because if you look at modern career advice, you're supposed to pick a lane. But she is everywhere. She has a son at 17. She briefly marries a Greek electrician named Tosh Angelos. And by her early 20s, she is dancing and singing at a nightclub in San Francisco called the Purple Onion. This is where the name change happens, right?
Her managers at the club suggested that Marguerite Johnson didn't quite capture the energy of her calypso performances, so she blended her childhood nickname Maya, which came from her brother calling her Maya's sister, with a variation of her former married surname.
And Maya Angelou is born?
Maya Angelou was born, and she leaned into this persona entirely. She records an album called Miss Calypso in 1957. She tours Europe and Africa in a production of the opera Porgy and Bess.
See, here's where it gets really interesting for me. How does a calypso dancer and nightclub singer become a key organizer for Martin Luther King Jr.? I don't understand the mechanism of that jump. What connects those two worlds?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see that it's actually the exact same skill set, just applied to a different goal. While she was touring Europe, she made a rigorous practice of learning the language of every country she visited.
Oh, so she wasn't just performing.
Right. She picked up French, Spanish, Italian, and later Arabic and Fanti. She was building an immense capacity to communicate across cultures. When she returned to the U.S. and heard Martin Luther King Jr. speak in 1960, she was deeply moved, so she used her nightclub background. She and the novelist John Oliver Killens organized the Cabaret for Freedom.
Yeah, I see. So she's taking the literal showmanship booking talent, managing egos, producing an event, rallying a crowd, and using it to raise funds for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Exactly, the SCLC. She was so effective at leveraging her network and organizational skills that MLK named her the Northern Coordinator for the organization. She proved that a career path doesn't have to be a straight ladder. Every seemingly disconnected experience, the languages, the stage presence, the networking fed directly into her ability to mobilize people for civil rights.
And she didn't hide the messier parts of this era either. During these years, she worked a myriad of odd jobs, including stints in the sex trade as a prostitute and a madam. And she wrote about this incredibly candidly later in life.
She really did.
She wasn't glorifying it, but she wanted young people to realize that everyone makes mistakes, everyone has survival chapters, and you have to forgive yourself to move forward. She used her gritty reality to become the people's poet.
Which is a crucial aspect of her legacy. She never sanitized her survival, and that global perspective she cultivated only widened. In the early 1960s, she moves to Cairo, Egypt, where she works as an associate editor for a weekly English-language newspaper. Then she moves to Accra, Ghana, working as a university administrator and a freelance writer.
And looking at the historical record from her time in Africa, it's clear she wasn't just passively observing these massive political shifts. She becomes close friends with Malcolm X while he is visiting Ghana. She's involved in anti-apartheid movements. She's cheering for Fidel Castro in Harlem. She was intentionally embedding herself in the intense geopolitical friction of the 1960s to understand the global human condition, regardless of how polarizing those figures were at the time. And again, our goal here isn't to take a stance on those political figures, but just to highlight how deeply involved she was in the global discourse.
That's a great point. She recognized that Black liberation wasn't just an American conversation, it was a global movement. She was gathering the stories, the pain, and the strategies of oppressed people worldwide. And she eventually returns to the United States with the intention of working closely with Malcolm X to build a new organization.
But then, this vibrant, expansive activism crashes headfirst into unimaginable grief. Shortly after she returns, Malcolm X is assassinated. And then, as she is reeling from that, she agrees to help Martin Luther King Jr. organize a march. But before they can really begin, MLK is assassinated in 1968 on her 40th birthday.
The devastation was absolute. I mean, these weren't just political figures to her. These were her close friends and collaborators. The double blow left her completely adrift. For years afterwards, she stopped celebrating her birthday entirely, choosing instead to send flowers to MLK's widow, Coretta Scott King.
How do you even begin to process that level of compounding grief? You've lost your friends, the leaders of your movement, and the hope of an era all at once.
You don't process it easily. She sank into a deep depression. And this is where the pivot to literature truly begins. Her friend, the legendary writer James Baldwin, recognized that she needed a conduit for this pain.
Baldwin was such a pivotal figure for her.
He was. He gently encouraged her out of her isolation. He took her to a dinner party at the home of Jules Feiffer, a cartoonist, where she ended up telling stories of her childhood. And there, an editor from Random House, Robert Loomis, heard her.
And Loomis pulls off what might be the greatest editorial trick in history. He knows she considers herself a poet and a playwright, not an autobiographer, so he essentially dares her. He tells her it's nearly impossible to write an autobiography that could be considered high art.
It was a highly calculated psychological tactic. He challenged her ambition, and it worked. The result was the 1969 publication of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. But to produce this high art, to extract the raw, human truth from a life that contained both global adventure and unspeakable trauma, she had to construct that intense writing ritual we talked about at the beginning.
Right, let's go back to that hotel room, the strip walls. She brought a very specific toolkit with her.
Yeah.
Yellow legal pads, a bottle of sherry, a deck of cards to play solitaire, a copy of Roget's Thesaurus, and the Bible.
Yes, the essentials.
She would lie across the bed, write 10 to 12 pages a day from the early morning until the early afternoon, and then go home and ruthlessly edit them down to 3 or 4 pages.
We have to understand the psychology behind this environment. She explicitly stated she didn't do this for catharsis. Writing wasn't a therapy session for her. She did this to enchant herself.
Enchant herself.
Yeah. By removing all visual stimuli, taking the pictures off the walls, she was creating a vacuum. She noted that she needed to get back into the time she was writing about. She used a term Sturm und Drang, which is a German literary movement that translates to storm and stress. It's all about extremes of emotion.
Oh, I see.
She had to actively plunge herself back into the fear of the rape, the agony of the mutinous, the storm and stress of her past to ensure she was capturing the absolute emotional reality on the page.
I think the detail about playing solitaire is genius. It's exactly like a mental loading screen on a computer. It's a low-stakes, repetitive, hypnotic task. It occupies the busy, surface-level part of your brain so that your defenses drop. And while your hands are busy flipping cards, those deeply buried subconscious memories are allowed to float to the surface uninhibited.
That's a highly accurate way to look at it. She noted that it might take an hour of playing cards to slip into that state of enchantment. But once she was there, the memories flowed. She didn't fight the pain, she admitted it and let it come.
Think about your own workflows. What kind of environment do you have to construct, physically and mentally, to tackle your most demanding, emotionally taxing work? We all need a ritual to access that deeper level of focus.
And the work she produced in those hotel rooms did much more than just chronicle her past. It challenged the fundamental grammar of the autobiography. She created a new subgenre that critics called autobiographical fiction.
Wait, if she was trying to capture the absolute emotional reality, why call it fiction?
Because she deliberately used the tools of a novelist to tell a true story. She used invented or polished dialogue, thematic pacing, and plot development to make the truth resonate louder. But her most significant innovation was her use of the first person singular. She used I to mean we.
How does that actually work on the page? How does one person's specific trauma speak for an entire community?
This raises an important question about her literary lineage. She was consciously following the African-American slave narrative tradition. Think of writers like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Jacobs. In those narratives, the author's personal story of escaping bondage wasn't just about them. It was a proxy for the entire enslaved population.
Oh, wow. I never made that connection.
Yeah, Angelou adopted this. When she wrote, "I was a young black girl facing this systemic barrier," she was structuring the narrative so that any black woman reading it could see their own reflection. She was the protagonist, but she was functioning as a stand-in for the broader Black American experience.
Because she refused to sanitize her story, because she kept the trauma and the grit in the text, her book became one of the most frequently banned books in libraries and schools across America. Parents constantly objected to the candid depictions of racism and sexuality.
Which happens so often with raw, honest work.
It does. Yet, paradoxically, that exact raw honesty is what propelled her to the absolute pinnacle of cultural recognition. Fast forward to 1993, and Bill Clinton asks her to recite a poem at his presidential inauguration.
She reads, "On the Pulse of Morning." It was the first inaugural poetry reading since Robert Frost spoke at JFK's inauguration in 1961. The broadcast is viewed by millions globally. The recording of the poem wins a Grammy. Her book sales surge by 1,200%. She transitions from a respected author to an undeniable global icon.
But with that massive platform came intense academic scrutiny. The pushback wasn't just from pearl-clutching parents banning books. Literary critics were deeply divided on her methods.
They were. There was a fierce debate over the nature of truth in life writing. For instance, the linguist John McWhorter heavily criticized her work. He argued that the dialogue in her books was highly unrealistic. He felt that it had been artificially cleaned up to defend black culture against negative stereotypes. He called her works apologetic writing, suggesting she was trying too hard to be a pristine representative of her race rather than just presenting flawed, complex individuals.
But then you have critics on the other side, like Hilton Als, who praised her for doing exactly what McWhorter criticized. Als argued that Angelou's specific style allowed black women to write about blackness from the inside, without having to translate, apologize, or defend themselves to a white audience. She was defining her own cultural space.
And, this tension between factual accuracy and emotional resonance persisted throughout her life. She notoriously refused to clarify the exact number of times she was married, fearing it would make her sound frivolous to a public that expected a certain decorum from a civil rights icon.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, she blurred timelines to make the narrative arc of her books more compelling. It leaves us with a fascinating philosophical debate. Can a story be culturally and emotionally true, even if the verbatim dialogue is polished or the dates are slightly shifted?
So what does this all mean? Ultimately, I think the sheer scale of her legacy answers that question. In 2022, the U.S. Mint placed Maya Angelou on the quarter, making her the first black woman to appear on U.S. currency. The fact that her books are taught worldwide, the fact that she received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, proves that the profound emotional truth of her work, the way she made people feel seen and understood, completely eclipsed the academic debates over her timelines.
Her ultimate goal was to articulate the human truth. And the human truth is rarely a tidy chronological list of verifiable facts. It is about how we experience the chaotic events of our lives, how we survive the unimaginable, and how we construct meaning from the wreckage. She didn't just survive her circumstances, she authored them. She took control of the narrative.
We are all editing our own autobiographies in real time. When you talk about your past to a friend, or on a date, or in a job interview, how much of the narrative you tell is strictly legally factual, and how much of it is the curated emotional truth of how you survived your own challenges?
It is a universal human impulse to shape our stories. But Maya Angelou did it on a scale that provided a blueprint for millions of others to find their own voices. From a traumatized, mute little girl in rural Arkansas to a global sage, she proved that you can endure the fire and use it to light the way for others.
She absolutely did. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, wildly surprising contradiction from her sources to chew on. Despite her status as this profound, almost spiritual sage, the woman that presidents called upon for moral clarity. She was incredibly grounded in the pragmatism of survival.
Oh, this is one of my favorite details about her.
It's brilliant. When literary purists pushed back on her commercial endeavors, like when she agreed to write greeting cards for Hallmark, she didn't apologize. She had a blunt response. She said she agreed with the 19th century writers who proudly declared, "I write for money."
It is a remarkably refreshing and pragmatic statement from someone so deeply revered for her artistry. It completely shatters the pretentious illusion that true artists must suffer in poverty or pretend they don't care about commerce to remain pure.
Exactly. It makes you wonder, can pure pragmatism and profound artistry coexist in your own life? Are we allowed to view ourselves as both a spiritual masterpiece and a work in progress hustler just trying to pay the bills? Maya Angelou proved you can be both. You don't have to follow a neat linear ladder. You can be the slingshot. You can sit in the silence, gather your strength, and launch yourself into a dozen different lives, owning the truth of every single one of them. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep learning, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.